Well, welcome back. As promised, we are now going to get into a conversation with former Statistician-General Dr Pali Lehohla. And he says that South Africa is one of the United Nations countries that have built a strong statistical base, but that this information is often ignored by politicians through intentional ignorance. Now, Dr Lehohla says that the country as the country approaches elections, politicians will be arguing about progress or the lack thereof, and they will bring up excuses such as drought, corruption, COVID-19, the insurrection, floods, fires, and all of these things that they usually do. But he also says that statistics will be thrown around to prove the unprovable, as it has increasingly become a norm for politicians to do. The former Statistician General further argues that the country's politics is becoming less informed despite the mountains of statistics and data at the disposal of those in power. Now, Dr Pali Lehohla is a former Statistician General here in South Africa, a Director of Economic Modelling Academy and a Professor of Practice at the University of Johannesburg, and he joins us now virtually. Dr Lehohla, always a pleasure to have you with us here on Morning Live. Welcome.
Morning, and how are you? Thank you very much for inviting me.
Always great when we have you. So firstly, let's just start by basically laying the basis for why statistics is important.
Well, statistics basically, as the name says, it's a state science, and therefore it's important because it talks about the craft of the state. That's where the name comes from, statistics. It's about the state and the governance of the state, the science of the state. And the state cannot do without these numbers. In fact, Napoleon Bonaparte loved statistics so much that he would ask any statistician what are the numbers, and he would give the statisticians the rule. And that's what made the French statistics system very, very, very strong, because Bonaparte actually created the platform for it. So statistics are very important, basically in the matter of war. In Egypt, CAPMAS, the Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics, the numbers were about how you count and mobilize for instances of war. So this is why the numbers are very, very important. In South Africa, for instance, under apartheid, they also went into a 5-yearly census in order to see whether the apartheid homeland system works. From 1980, the numbers were counted 80, 85, 90, and every 5 years they wanted to understand whether their apartheid policies are working, from a 10-year to a 5-year. So these numbers are very, very crucial. They are a conduit of trust. They are the science of the state. Now,
Dr Lehohla, you were the Statistician General for South Africa for many years. What is your observation currently, and perhaps if you wish to reflect, your observation on the manner in which data and statistics are utilized by government and its agencies, and even the public at large, whether it's about life expectancy, education levels, poverty, whatever you may deem to use at any given point in time. What are your observations in that regard?
Well, I mean, there is a tragedy of not observing the numbers. And, you know, it's important to know that there is a GDP, there is these numbers on economics, there is numbers on prices, there are these numbers on population, there are these numbers on health, education, and all that. But unless we use them in an interconnected fashion to understand what they actually mean, we hardly have scratched the surface. Our knowledge about them is of a meager type, as Lord Kelvin would say. They have hardly started doing the science of the numbers. And I think most of the time our politics are hung in the space where each time the number is raised, they come and look at it and observe it and get amazed by it, and then from there walk away. So the interconnectedness of the numbers from things like number of births in South Africa, what are the forms of those births? For instance, on 62% of the birth certificates for children in South Africa, the name of the father doesn't exist. And when you see that, you have to get really worried about what form of society we are. And therefore, your policies must be responsive to that kind of number in order to protect the children and to protect the mothers. I would expect then the policies on education would seek to sponsor everyone with free education. Because with that kind of number, you are sure that the conversations at home are not so lekker. And if you have to say that we are going to nitpick those who have the means, then you haven't hardly started understanding what the statistics actually mean. So there are so many of those gaps. I mean, if you think about the district development model, you realize that the numbers actually look at the district as a spatial configuration that is fixed instead of one with necessarily flexible boundaries and what we would call a variable geometry, not contiguous geometry. Although the geometry of districts is contiguous, but the geometry of products and activities is very, very much variable. So unless you understand these numbers in those kinds of contexts, you cannot govern. And I think those are serious gaps in the way our governance systems work. Unless you organize them in a more systematic way to inform planning, you have serious problems. And most of the time we use the statistics that are more backward looking instead of modeling forward for the future and ensuring that and understanding that human beings have agency. And markets, yes, do help, but they don't quite work because they don't have that much agency. Markets don't have, they have their own agency, but human beings have superior agency because they can intervene. And you have to use statistics in order to do that. So there are these serious gaps in our intellectual space, particularly amongst the politics.
So when you talk about the intentional ignorance in this regard, Dr. Lehohla, are you referring to what you've just explained to us? Is there more to it? And when you talk about the agency of human beings, surely the reason why perhaps all of this data and statistics would be ignored is because the citizenry, the electorate by and large, is perhaps not exercising their own agency, because one could argue that this data is available to them as well.
Oh, yes. I mean, Stats SA has become a visible icon that cannot hide. It's a city on the hill. So the numbers are there, but they are not being used. So you can argue that there is a lot of intentionality to ignore these numbers or even create own numbers and avoid the ones that Stats SA produces. And this brings an imbalance in the system of governance when people start using their own numbers and not those that come out of Stats SA or produce these numbers. I mean, these numbers have to be produced by the chief statistician. So anyone who starts producing their own numbers on employment of the youth and the like brings imbalance and impossible understanding of the dynamics of how the country functions.
And I basically had a little chuckle at the use of words because, you know, speaking of the agency of just the general populace in this country, you do say that the gullible public will not ask the right questions and use the existing evidence to seriously probe the policies that our politicians will be throwing at us, especially now going into elections. But maybe you could just help us out. What sort of questions should the public be asking about these policies?
I would expect the parliament, after the president has presented the SONA, or the Minister of Finance has presented the finance budget, to ask, how does this help us in unemployment, inequality, and joblessness? And I would ask those questions. And you'll find that in the speeches, it's just exhortations. There isn't any progress towards that. And I would ask these questions because most of the time, the president's speech, the Minister of Finance speech, are inputs and not impacts. They don't talk to impacts, they talk to inputs. And inputs are simple. I mean, you know how much money you use, but how you then get the impact, the necessary impact, that's a complex question. And it plays in the realm of planning, where you look at the interconnectedness of the statistics of people from birth to death. And those questions are not asked. Only the parliament will rise and applaud. And they'll say, why are you applauding? So the public is very gullible. They don't ask them about serious things during their presentations. For instance, unemployment has become the biggest driver of poverty in South Africa, and it has been galloping, and it has doubled in half the time that it was between 2001 to 2010, and 2010 to 2011 to 2016. In half the time, unemployment as a driver of poverty doubled. Yet the politicians will come and talk about water sanitation, as important as they are, but they are less of a factor. They will not talk about the seriousness of the combination of unemployment and education and how all this pan out. So you don't see a responsive policy space to what these numbers articulate.
Well, so interesting and much to chew on there. Thanks so much, Dr. Pali Lehohla. Always a pleasure engaging with the former Statistician General. And he says that South Africa is one of the nations that have built a strong statistical base, but this information is often ignored. Intentional ignorance is what the former Statistician General talks about. But we'll leave it there for the time being.